오늘은 Culture Map Chapter 3를 하겠습니다. Chapter 3는 여기 Why versus How. The art of persuasion in the multicultural world. The art of persuasion is one of the most crucial business skills. Without the ability to persuade others to support your idea, you won't be able to attract the support you need to turn those ideas into realities. And though most people are unaware of it, the ways you seek to persuade others and the kinds of arguments you find persuasive are deeply rooted in your culture's philosophical, religious, and educational assumptions and attitudes. Far from being universal, then the art of persuasion is one that is profoundly culture-based. What was the hard lessons learned by Cara Williams, an American engineer newly working as a research manager for a German firm in the automotive industry? As one of the leading experts in her field, William had extensive experience presenting recommendations and influencing her American college to follow her ideas. But when Williams began working in a German environment, she didn't realize that being persuasive would require a different approach. When I think back to my first presentations to my new German bosses, I wish I had understood the difference and hadn't let their feedback get under my skin. If I had held my cool, I might have been able to salvage the situation. Williams has faced many challenges in her career. Before taking the job with the German firm, she worked for an Australian company from her home office in Boston, traveling frequently to the Sydney headquarters to give presentations and offer advice. A lot of my job relies on my ability to sell my ideas and influence my internal clients to take the best path, she explains. I'm good at what I do, but I hate constant long distance travel. When offered a similar position working for a German auto supplier, I jumped at the opportunity for shorter travel distances. Williams' first project was providing technical advice on how to reduce carbon emissions from one of the group's green car models. After visiting several automotive plants, observing the systems and processes there, and meeting with dozens of experts and end users, Williams developed a set of recommendations that she felt would meet the company's strategic and budgetary goals. She traveled to Munich to give a 1 hour presentation to the decision makers, a group of German directors. It was my first internal presentation, and its success would be important for my reputation, William recalls. In preparation for the meeting, Williams thought carefully about how to give the most persuasive presentation, practicing her arguments, anticipating questions that might arise and preparing responses to their questions. William delivered her presentations in a small auditorium with the directors seated in rows of upholstered chairs. She began by giving right to the point, explaining the strategies she would recommend based on her findings. But before she had finished with the first slide, one of the directors raised his hand and protested. How did you get these conclusions? These conclusions? Are you giving us your recommendations? But I don't understand how you got here. How many people did you interview? What questions did you ask? Then another director jumped in. Please explain what methodologies you use for analyzing your data and how that led you to come to these findings. I was taken aback, Williams remembers. I assured them that the methodologies behind my recommendations was sound, but the questions and challenges continued. The more they questioned me, the more I got the feeling that they were attacking my credibility, which puzzles and annoyed me. I have a PhD in engineering and expertise that is widely acknowledged. Their efforts to test my conclusions, I felt, showed a real lack of respect. What arrogance to think that they would be better able to judge what than I am. Williams reached defensively, and the presentations went downhill from there. I kick myself now for having allowed their approach to derail my points. She said, needless to say, they did not approve my recommendations, and 3 months of research time went down the drain. The storm Wall Williams ran into illustrates the hard truth that our ability to persuade others depends not simply on the strength of our message, but on how we build our arguments and the persuade techniques we employ. Jens Huppert is a German director at the company William worked for. Having lived in the United States for many years, he had experienced similar failure at persuading others. Though the cultural disconnect ran in the opposite direction, Hubert recalled the problems he had the first few times he tried to make a persuasive arguments before a group of his American colleges. He had carefully launched his presentation by laying the foundation for his conclusions, setting the parameters, outlining his data and his methodologies, and explaining the premise of his arguments. He was taken aback when the American boss told him, in your next presentations, get right to the point. You lost their attention before you even got to the important part. Hubert was assured. These are intelligent people, he thought. Why would they swallow my arguments if I haven't built it carefully for them from the ground up? The opposing reactions that Williams and Hubert received reflect the cultural differences between German and American styles of persuasion. The the approach taken by the Germans is based on the specific style of reasoning that is deeply ingrained in the cultural cycle. Human explains. Hubert explains. In German, we try to understand the theory, theoretical concept before adapting it to the practical situation. To understanding something, we first want to analyze all the conceptual data before coming to the conclusion. When colleagues from cultures like the US or the UK make presentations to us, we don't realize that they were taught to think differently from us. So when they begin by presenting conclusions and recommendations without setting up the parameters and how they got to those conclusions, it can actually shock us. We may feel insulted. Do they think we're stupid that we will just swallowing anything? Or we may question whether their decisions was well thought out. This reaction is based on our deep-seated belief that you cannot come to the conclusions without first defining the parameters. Hubert's time in the United States taught him that Americans have a very different approach. They focused on the practicalities rather than theory. So they are much more likely to begin with their recommendations. Unfortunately, these reasoning methods can backfire when making presentation to an audience whose methods of thinking is the opposite, as Carl Williams discovered. Two styles of reasoning. Principles first versus applications first. Principle first reasoning sometimes refers to deductive reasoning, derives conclusions or facts from general principles or concepts. For example, we may start with a general principle like all men are mortal. Then we move to more specific examples. Justin Bieber is a man. That leads us to the conclusion Justin Bieber will eventually die. Similarly, we may start with the generic principle. Everything made of copper conducts electricity. Then we show that the old statue of the repression your grandmother left you is 100% copper. Based on these points, we can arrive at the conclusions. Your grandmother's statue will conduct electricity. In both examples, we started with the general principle and moved from it to practical conclusions. On the other hand, applications first reasoning, sometimes called inductive reasoning, general conclusions are reached based on a pattern of factual observations from the real world. For example, if you travel to my hometown in Minnesota 100 times during January and February, and you observe every visit that the temperature is considerably below zero, you will conclude that Minnesota winters are cold, and that a winter visit to Minnesota calls for a warm coat as well as a scarf, wood hat, gloves, and ear warmers. In this case, you observe data from the real world, and based on these empirical observations, you draw broader conclusions. Most people are capable of practicing both principle first and applications first reasoning, but your habitual patterns of reasoning is heavily influenced by the kind of thinking emphasized in your culture's educational structure. As a result, you can quickly run into problems when working with people who are most accustomed to other modes of reasoning. Take math class as an example. In a course using the application first method, you first learn the formula and practice applying it. After seeing how this formula leads to the right answer again and again, you then move on to understand concept or principle underpinning it. This means you may spend 80% of your time focusing on the concrete tool and how to apply it, and only 20% of your time considering its conceptual or theoro- theoretical explanations. School systems in Anglo-Saxon countries tends to emphasize these methods of teaching. By contrast, in a principle first math class, you first prove the general principle and only that use it to develop a concrete formula that can be applied to the various problems. From a French manager once told me that we had to calculate the value of pi as a class before we used the pi in a formula. In this kind of math class, that you may spend 80% of your time focusing on the concepts and theories underpinning the general mathematical principles and only 20% of your time applying those principles to concrete problems. School systems in Latin Europe, French, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and Germany countries, Germany, Australia, and Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, tend to emphasize these methods of teaching. I felt the full force of the applications first methods when I studied Russian in my American high school. When we walked into Mr. Tresov's class on the first day of school, he immediately fired questions at us in Russian. We didn't understand a thing, but gradually we started to understand, and after a few lessons, we began to putting words together any which way we could. And then with the Tarasov's guidance, we began using sentences whose structure who did not understand to create the conceptual grammatical frameworks. By contrast, in a principled first language class, learning starts with understanding the grammatical principles underpinning the language structure. Once you have a solid initial grasp of the grammar and vocabulary, you begin to practice using language. This is the way my husband learned English in French school, and ironically, his knowledge of the grammar is far superior to that of many Americans. This disadvantage is that students spend less time practicing the language, which may mean they write it better than they speak it. In business, as in school, people from principles first cultures generally want to understand the why behind their boss request before they move to actions. Meanwhile, applications first learners tend to focus less on the why and more on the how. One of the most common frustrations among French employees with the American bosses is that the American tells that what to do without explaining why they need to do it. They need to do it. From the French perspective, this can feel demotivating and even disrespectful. By contrast, American bosses may feel that French workers are uncooperative because instead of acting quickly, they always ask why and are not ready to act until they have received a suitable response. Country positions on the persuading scale. In general, Anglo-Saxon cultures like the United States and the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand tend to fall to the far right on the persuading skills. See Figure 3.1, where application first cultures are clustered. As we move across the scale, there's a Nordic clusters where we find Scandinavia and Netherlands. Mm, Latin Americans and Germanic cultures are considerably more principles first than the United States, but much less so than their Latin European cousins, so we put them around the middle of the scale. French, Russian, and Belgium appeared on the principal first side of the scale. As always, remember the first importance of the cultural relativity. Where a given country falls on the scale matters less than where two cultures fall relative to one another. The British tilt rather far towards the applications first end of the scale. But Yessa Touafik, an Egyptian manager for Merck Pharmaceutical, has this to say about his experience of studying in both the United Kingdom and the United States. In the UK, the learning was all about concept. Only after we struggled through the theoretical that we got to practical application. The US was exactly the opposite. Even before I attended the class, I was already given the case study as pre-work, an example of practical application. In the classroom, it was all about the 3 L's of leadership or the 6 C's of customer satisfaction. From moment one, we were immersed in practical solutions and examples of how to apply the solutions. The persuading skill is like that. This is the persuading skills. And print applications first is that individuals are trained begin with the fact statements or opinion and later add the concepts to back up or explain the conclusion as necessary. The preference is to begin a message or report with an executive summary or bullet points. The discussions are approached in a practical, concrete manner. Theoretical or philosophy discussions are avoided in a business environment. Individuals Principles first is that individuals have been trained to first develop the theory or complex concept before presenting a fact, statement, or opinion. The preference is to begin a message or reporting by building up the theoretical arguments before moving on to conclusions. The conceptual principles underlying its situations are valued. Alright, back to the page 97. Compared with other European cultures, the United Kingdom is quite applications first. But when the United Kingdom is measured against the United States, it appears strongly principles first, a vivid illustration of the power of the cultural relativity to shape our perceptions. You may be wondering where the Asian cultures fall on the persuading scales since they don't appear in the diagram. Actually, the view of the world most common in Asian cultures is so different from that of European influenced cultures that entirely different frame of reference. Unrelated to persuading skills comes to play. We will discuss that uniquely Asian perspective later in this chapter. When philosophy meets business. Different cultures have different systems for learning, in parts because of the philosophers who influenced the approach to intellectual life in a general and science in particular. Although Aristotle, a Greek, is credited with articulating applications first thinking inductions, it was the British thinkers, including Roger Bacon in the 13th century and Francis Bacon in the 16th century, who popularized these methodologies among modern scholars and scientists. Later, Americans, with their pioneer mentality and disinclinations towards theoretical learning, came to be even more applications first than the British. By contrast, philosophy on the European continent has been largely driven by principles first approaches. In the 17th century, French René Descartes spelled out of methods of principles first reasoning in which the scientist first formulates a hypothesis, then seeks evidence to approve or disapprove it. Descartes was deeply skeptical of the data based on mere observations and sought a deeper understanding of underlying principles. In the 19th century, the German Friedrich Hegel introduced the dialectic model of deductions, which reigns supreme in school in Latin and Germanic countries. The Hegelian dialectic begins with the thesis or foundations of arguments. This is opposed by antithesis or conflicting arguments, and the two are then reconciled in a synthesis. Clear examples of applications first and principle first reasoning styles can also be found in the legal system of different societies. The British and American systems are based on common law, in which a judgment in one case sets a precedent for future cases. A clear example of applications for thinking. By contrast, most European Union states use the civil law system that originated in Roman law, and Napoleonic Code, in which a general statute or principle is applied on a case-by-case basis, mirroring the principles first approach. Interestingly, Scandinavian uses the hybrid legal systems that does not fall neatly into either camp. Note the middle positions of the Nordic countries on the persuading scale. As we've seen, the way different societies analyze the words depends on their philosophy roots. These, in turn, define how we learned in school and how we behave as the adults at work. It's what Frenchman Stéphane Perron realized when he found his highly persuasive writing was not having much effect on his British colleagues. Graduates of the prestige Polytechnic Polytechnic Engineering School, now on the fast track at the large French industrial company. Baron was working for Michelin and Clermont-Ferrand, France, as part of the global team, whose other members were located mainly in the United Kingdom. Baron recalls, "My British colleagues were not reading many of my emails, especially the most important ones. It was starting to annoy me. I liked my British colleagues a lot, and when we were face to face, we had a great connections. But I had multiple indications that when I sent emails to my team, they simply didn't read it. And I knew the British were big email writers themselves, so I didn't think it could be cultural. For example, Bahom recalls carefully crafting a persuade email written to propose a number of key changes to company processes. The structure of his message looked something like this. Paragraph 1 introduced the topic. Paragraph 2 builds up his agreement, appealing to his teammates' sense of logic and developing the general principle. Paragraph 3 addressed the most obvious potential concern with the Baron's argument. Paragraph 4 explained the Baron's conclusions and asked for his teammates' support. Well educated in one of the most principled first cultures in the world, Baron instinctively followed the directive methods so carefully taught in the French school system. Notice how his second, third, and fourth paragraphs neatly presents the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Baron developed after much pondering of his topic. On reflection, however, it's very obvious why Baron's British colleagues did not read this email. Based on the applications first principle of get to the point quickly and stick to it, they got through paragraph 1 and seeing no clear point up front, move to the email message that they read at some undefined date in the future file. If Carl Williams and Stefan Bohong had a better understanding of the applications first and principle first cultural tendencies, they would each have had the chance to be a good deal more persuasive. If William had realized she was presenting to an audience of principal first Germans, perhaps she would have begun by presenting the paradigms of her study and explaining why she chose this specific study method. She might then, she might then have introduced specific data to show her reasoning before presenting conclusions and recommendations. She would have needed to spend 30 minutes building her arguments, 5 solid minutes describing her methods before jumping to her results, would probably have created a lot of buy-in. In addition, if William had recognized the crucial roles of the antithesis, the counter-argument in the deductive process, she might have welcomed the challenge from her audience as a sign of interest instead of a lack of respect. Similarly, if Baron had realized he was writing for a group based on applications first approaches, perhaps he would have started his email with a few bullet points summarizing his proposal and explaining what he needed from the group. He might then have continued with a bit of background data presented briskly with the recognitions that shorter is sweater for people with the applications first orientations. Bahon subsequently learned this lesson. One British colleague told me that if my email doesn't fit on the screen of an iPhone, it risks not getting read. Barhon laughed. That's the test I use now before I send out my email. The moral is clear. Presenting to Londoners or to New Yorkers, get to the point and stick to it. Get to the point and stick to it. Presenting to French, Spaniards, or Germans, spending more time setting the parameter and explain the backgrounds before jumping to your conclusion.